The dust had barely settled on her father's grave when Zelda Zimmerman realized she could no longer stay in Philadelphia, not with her stepmother's plans to marry her off to the oldest banker in the city to settle his debts. It was September of 1878, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets as Zelda crept down the servants' staircase of her family's grand brick townhouse. Her father, Theodore Zimmerman, had been dead only 3 weeks, his heart giving out under the weight of financial ruin he had kept hidden from everyone except his new wife, a woman who had married him 6 months prior with dollar signs in her cold eyes. When the creditors came calling, Zelda discovered the truth. Her father had lost nearly everything in bad railway investments, and what remained was barely enough to keep the house. Her stepmother's solution was swift and mercenary. Zelda would marry Harold Pemberton, a 72-year-old banker with gout and wandering hands, who would graciously absorb the remaining debts in exchange for a young bride. Zelda had other plans. She carried only a small carpet bag containing a change of clothes, her mother's silver locket, and what little money she had managed to take from her own jewelry box after pawning 2 rings. It amounted to $47, which seemed like a fortune as she purchased a ticket heading west. The ticket agent had looked at her skeptically when she asked for passage to the furthest destination her money would allow. She ended up with a ticket to St. Louis, with plans to work her way further west from there. The journey took weeks. Zelda worked as a laundress in St. Louis for 2 months, saving every penny while sleeping in a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and desperation. She avoided questions about her past, claiming to be a widow, which seemed to satisfy most people's curiosity. By December, she had saved enough to join a wagon train heading to Colorado, where she had heard there were opportunities for teachers and seamstresses in the mining towns. But the wagon train was a disaster from the start. The guide was a drunk who miscalculated their supplies, and when they were 3 weeks into the journey, he disappeared in the night with half their provisions. The remaining travelers argued about whether to press on or turn back. Zelda, along with 2 other families, decided to continue, believing they were close to a settlement marked on their crude map. They were wrong. A winter storm struck with brutal efficiency in early January of 1879, scattering their small group across the unforgiving landscape of eastern Colorado territory. Zelda found herself separated from the others, her horse having bolted during the worst of the blizzard. She walked for days, her food running out, her water frozen. The elegant boots she had worn from Philadelphia were never meant for this terrain, and her feet bled inside them. She rationed the last of her hardtack until there was nothing left but crumbs, and then not even that. On the 5th day, she could no longer feel her fingers or toes. The landscape was an endless stretch of white broken occasionally by scrub brush and skeletal trees. She had no idea which direction she was heading, only that stopping meant death. Her carpetbag had been abandoned 2 days prior, too heavy to carry. She kept only the locket around her neck, clutched in her frozen hand. When she finally collapsed, it was near a creek bed, the water frozen solid beneath a layer of snow. She lay there, unable to rise, watching the sky turn from gray to darker gray as evening approached. This was not how she had imagined her grand escape ending. She thought of her father, of his kind eyes and gentle laugh, and wished she could tell him she had at least tried to live on her own terms. The sound of hoofbeats seemed like a dream at first. Blake Thorne had been tracking the deer for the better part of the afternoon, following its prints through the fresh snow. He was a tall man of 26, lean and weathered from years of working cattle ranches across Colorado and Wyoming. His dark hair hung past his collar, and his blue eyes had the permanent squint of someone who spent his life looking at distant horizons. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and leather gloves, his hat pulled low against the cold. The deer had led him further from his camp than he had intended, but he needed the meat. Winter in the Colorado Territory was unforgiving, and he had been holed up in a lined shack on the edge of a ranch near Lone Pine, Colorado, watching over 100 head of cattle while the ranch owner spent the winter in Denver. It was lonely work, but Blake preferred it. He had been drifting for years, ever since his own family's ranch in Texas had been lost to a combination of drought and creditors when he was 19. He had no taste for settling down, no interest in putting down roots that could be torn up. He lost the deer's trail near the creek and was about to turn back when his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Rusty, suddenly balked and whinnied. Blake followed the horse's gaze and saw what looked like a pile of dark fabric against the snow. His first thought was that someone had lost part of their load, but as he rode closer, his chest tightened with realization. It was a woman, and she was not moving. Blake dismounted quickly, his boots crunching in the snow. He knelt beside her, his heart pounding. She was slight, with dark hair that had escaped its pins and lay matted with ice across her pale face. Her lips were blue, her skin like marble. For a terrible moment he thought he was too late, but then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest. "Miss," he said urgently, pulling off his glove to touch her face. Her skin was like ice. "Miss, can you hear me?" There was no response. Her eyes were closed, her body completely limp. Blake looked around quickly, assessing the situation. The sun would be down within the hour, and the temperature would drop even further. She would not survive the night out here, and truthfully, he was not sure she would survive the next hour. He made a decision quickly. The lined shack was a hard 2-hour ride from here, too far. But he had made a temporary camp in a cluster of rocks about 30 minutes back, with a fire already built and some shelter from the wind. It would have to do. Blake gathered the woman into his arms, shocked at how light she was, as though she were made of hollow bones like a bird. He managed to mount Rusty while holding her, settling her across his lap. She made a small sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, but did not wake. He wrapped his coat around her as much as he could and urged Rusty into a steady lope, not too fast to risk dropping her, but fast enough to matter. The ride back to his camp seemed to take forever. Blake talked to her the whole way, though he did not know if she could hear him. "Stay with me now," he said. "We are almost there, just keep breathing. You are going to be all right." When he reached the camp, the fire had burned down to embers, but the rocks still held some heat. He dismounted carefully and carried the woman to his bedroll, laying her down as gently as he could. His hands worked quickly, building up the fire again until it roared with heat. Then he turned his attention to the woman. Her clothes were inadequate for the weather, a traveling dress made of wool but designed for fashion rather than warmth. It was damp with snow and sweat. Blake knew he needed to get her out of the wet clothes, but he hesitated, aware of the impropriety. Then he looked at her blue lips and shaking hands, and propriety seemed less important than survival. "Forgive me, miss," he murmured, and began to work. He removed her boots first, wincing at the blood staining her stockings. Her feet were a mess of blisters and cuts. Next came the dress, which he had to cut away in places where the fabric had frozen. He averted his eyes as much as possible, working quickly to wrap her in his spare blankets and his heavy coat. He checked her fingers and toes for frostbite, relieved to see that while they were dangerously cold, there was no blackening of the skin yet. Once she was bundled, he positioned her close to the fire and began to heat water in his tin pot. He had some jerky and beans, and he made a thin broth, hoping he could get some of it into her. He also packed snow into a cloth and used it to moisten her cracked lips. As he worked, he studied her face. She was young, probably around 21 or 22, with fine features that spoke of good breeding. Her hands, despite their current state, showed no signs of hard labor. This was not a woman accustomed to roughing it. What was she doing out here alone? It took nearly an hour, but slowly, color began to return to her cheeks. Her breathing deepened and steadied. Blake sat beside her, feeding the fire and watching her closely for any sign of waking. Night had fully fallen and the temperature had dropped severely. Without the fire and blankets, she would certainly have died. Around midnight she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered and she made a small sound of confusion. Blake leaned closer, his hand on her shoulder to keep her from trying to sit up too quickly. "Easy," he said softly. "You are safe. Do not try to move yet." Her eyes opened fully, and Blake found himself looking into eyes the color of dark amber, flecked with gold in the firelight. They were wide with fear and confusion. "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper, raw and cracked. "You are in the Colorado Territory," Blake said. "I found you near a creek. You were nearly frozen. I brought you to my camp." She tried to sit up and he helped her, supporting her back. She looked down at herself, realizing she was wrapped in blankets and wearing clothes that were not her own. Blake had dressed her in his spare shirt, which hung on her like a tent. A look of panic crossed her face. "I did not," Blake said quickly, understanding her fear. "I mean, I had to get you out of the wet clothes, but I did not. I was respectful. You were dying." She looked at him for a long moment, and he met her gaze steadily, letting her see the truth in his eyes. Finally, she nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die." "You almost did," Blake said honestly. He reached for the pot of broth, which he had kept warm by the fire. "Can you drink some of this? You need food." She nodded, and he held the cup to her lips. She drank slowly, wincing as the liquid touched her raw throat. When she had finished half the cup, she pulled back and he set it aside. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated, and he could see her weighing whether to trust him. "Zelda," she said finally. "Zelda Zimmerman." "Blake Thorne," he replied. "Can you tell me what happened? Why were you alone out there?" Tears suddenly filled her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "I was with a wagon train," she said, her voice breaking. "There was a storm. We got separated. I have been walking for days. I ran out of food 3 days ago. I do not know what happened to the others." Blake's jaw tightened. He had heard stories like this before. The frontier was littered with the bones of people who had been unprepared for its harshness. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Anywhere," she said, and there was such desperation in her voice that it made his chest ache. "I just needed to get away." He did not press for more details. Everyone who came west was running from something. "Well, you are safe now," he said, "but you are in bad shape. Your feet are torn up and you are severely malnourished. You need rest and food before you can travel anywhere." "I do not have any money," she said quickly. "I lost everything in the storm. I cannot pay you." "I am not asking for payment," Blake said, a bit more sharply than he intended. The idea that she thought he would demand payment for saving her life rankled him. "I am just telling you the truth. You cannot travel yet." She looked down at her hands and more tears fell. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I did not mean to offend you. I do not understand why you would help me." Blake softened. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said simply. "Now you need to rest. We will talk more in the morning." She nodded, exhaustion clear in every line of her body. He helped her lie back down, tucking the blankets around her. Within minutes she was asleep, her breathing soft and even. Blake sat by the fire, keeping watch. He told himself he would have done the same for anyone, and that was true. But something about this woman, about the sadness in her eyes and the determination that had kept her walking even when she was starving, had gotten under his skin. He had a feeling his life had just gotten a lot more complicated. Morning came cold and clear. Zelda woke to find Blake cooking something over the fire. The smell made her stomach clench with hunger so intense it was painful. He glanced over and saw she was awake, and he gave her a small smile. "Good morning," he said. "How do you feel?" "Like I was run over by a wagon," she admitted, her voice still rough. Every muscle in her body ached and her feet throbbed with pain. "That is about right," he said. He brought her a plate with beans and a piece of fried salt pork. "Eat slowly. Your stomach is not going to be happy with a lot of food all at once." She took the plate with shaking hands, and she had to force herself to follow his advice. Every instinct screamed at her to devour the food, but she took small bites, chewing slowly. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. As she ate, she studied the man who had saved her life. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and eyes that seemed to see everything. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living. There was a gentleness in the way he moved, though, that surprised her. "What were you doing out here?" she asked between bites. "I work for a ranch near Lone Pine," he said, pouring coffee from a battered pot into a tin cup. "I am staying in a lined shack for the winter, watching cattle." "I was out hunting when I found you." "Lone Pine," she repeated. "Is that far from here?" "About a day's ride in good weather," he said. He handed her the coffee, and she wrapped her hands around it gratefully, savoring the warmth. "But we are not going anywhere today. You need rest, and there is another storm coming." As if to punctuate his words, the wind picked up, howling through the rocks. Zelda shivered despite the fire and the blankets. "What about the cattle you are supposed to be watching?" she asked, worried suddenly that she was keeping him from his duties. "They will be fine for a day or two," Blake said. "There is a box canyon where most of them shelter during storms. They have food and water. They do not need me standing guard." She nodded, relieved. The last thing she wanted was to be responsible for him losing his job. They spent the day in camp, sheltering from the wind. Blake tended to her feet, cleaning the wounds and wrapping them in strips of cloth torn from his spare shirt. His touch was gentle but efficient, and though Zelda blushed at the intimacy of it, she was grateful. He also rationed out small amounts of food throughout the day, explaining that her body needed to adjust gradually. As the day wore on, they talked. Zelda found herself telling him things she had not intended to share. About her father's death, her stepmother's betrayal, the arranged marriage she had fled. Blake listened without judgment, his eyes on the fire. "My pa lost our ranch when I was 19, he said when she finished. "Debt and drought. I know what it is like to watch everything fall apart." "What did you do?" she asked. "Started drifting," he said with a shrug. "Worked cattle drives, ranch jobs, whatever I could find. I have been from Texas to Montana and most places in between." "Do you like it, the drifting?" He was quiet for a moment. "I used to think I did," he said slowly. "Now I am not so sure. It gets lonely after a while." There was something in his voice, a vulnerability that made Zelda's heart twist. She understood loneliness. She had been lonely her entire life, even in her father's house surrounded by servants and society. That night, the storm Blake had predicted rolled in with a vengeance. Snow fell heavily, and the wind screamed through the rocks. Blake had rigged up a tarp to create more shelter, and they huddled close to the fire, the blankets wrapped around both of them for warmth. It was improper, being so close to a man she barely knew, but propriety seemed absurd when survival was the alternative. "Tell me something happy," Zelda said at one point, needing to distract herself from the howling wind. "Tell me about the best day you ever had." Blake thought for a while. "I was about 10, he said finally. My pa took me to a horse auction. There was this colt, a little sorrel with a white blaze. He was wild, nobody could get near him. My pa bought him for almost nothing and he gave him to me, told me he was my responsibility. It took me 6 months to gentle that horse, but when I did, he was the best horse I ever owned. We were partners for 8 years until he died of colic. What was his name? Zelda asked. Copper, Blake said, and there was such fondness in his voice that Zelda smiled. My turn, she asked, and he nodded. I was 7. My mother was still alive. She took me to the park, just the two of us, no governesses or chaperones. We fed the ducks and ate sandwiches on the grass. She told me stories about when she was a little girl. She died a year later, and I never had another day like that. Blake's hand found hers under the blanket, and he squeezed gently. The gesture was so kind, so unexpected, that Zelda felt tears prick her eyes again. They stayed like that for a long time, listening to the storm, their hands clasped together. The storm lasted 2 days. By the time it cleared, Zelda was feeling stronger. The food and rest had helped, though her feet were still too sore for walking. Blake assessed the situation on the morning of the 3rd day, standing outside the shelter and looking at the deep snow. "We need to get to the line shack," he said when he came back to the fire. "You need better shelter and more food than I have here. Do you think you can ride if I put you on my horse?" "I can try," Zelda said. She was determined not to be a burden, even though the thought of sitting on a horse made her wince. Blake packed up the camp efficiently, and then he lifted Zelda onto Rusty's back. She bit her lip to keep from crying out as her sore muscles protested. Blake mounted behind her, his arms around her to hold the reins. She was intensely aware of his closeness, the solid warmth of his chest against her back. "Hold on," he said softly, and she gripped the saddle horn as Rusty began to move. The journey to the line shack was slow. The snow was deep, and Rusty had to pick his way carefully. Zelda drifted in and out of awareness, exhausted by the effort of staying upright. Blake's arms held her steady, and she found herself leaning back against him, trusting him to keep her safe. It was late afternoon when the line shack came into view. It was a simple structure, just one room built of rough logs with a stone chimney. But to Zelda, it looked like a palace. Blake dismounted and then carefully lifted her down, carrying her inside. The shack was sparse but functional. There was a small stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed built into one wall, and shelves stocked with supplies. Blake set Zelda on the bed and then went back out to tend to Rusty and retrieve the rest of his gear. When he came back in, he stoked the stove and set about making a proper meal. Zelda watched him move around the small space, noting the easy competence of his movements. He made coffee and fried bacon and beans, and the smell made her mouth water. They ate in companionable silence, and afterward Blake insisted that Zelda take the bed while he would sleep on the floor with his bedroll. She protested, but he was firm. "You are still recovering," he said. "You need the bed." "This is your home," she argued. "I cannot take your bed." "It is a line shack, not a home," he said. "And you are taking the bed. That is final." There was a note of command in his voice that brooked no argument. Zelda subsided, too tired to fight. Over the next week they fell into a routine. Blake checked on the cattle each day while Zelda rested and recovered. Her feet healed slowly, and she began to move around the cabin more. She insisted on doing what she could to help, cooking meals and tidying the small space. Blake tried to protest, but she was stubborn. "You saved my life," she said firmly. "The least I can do is cook dinner." They talked for hours in the evenings, sitting by the stove while the wind howled outside. Blake told her stories about his years drifting, about the places he had seen and the people he had met. Zelda told him about life in Philadelphia, about the parties and the social expectations that had always felt like a cage. "You miss it?" Blake asked one evening. "The fancy life." Zelda thought about it. "I miss my father," she said, "but the rest of it? No. I was never really suited for that world. I always felt like I was play acting, pretending to be someone I was not." "Who are you then?" Blake asked, his eyes on hers. "I am still figuring that out," she admitted. "But I think I am someone who wants to live on her own terms, even if those terms are harder." "That is a good person to be," Blake said quietly. As the days passed, Zelda became increasingly aware of Blake in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude. She noticed the way his hair fell into his eyes when he leaned over the stove, the way his hands moved with quiet confidence, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. She caught herself watching him, and more than once, she found him watching her in return. It was a dangerous thing, this growing awareness. She had fled west to escape an unwanted marriage, not to fall for a drifting cowboy with no prospects. But her heart did not seem to care about logic. One evening, about 10 days after they had arrived at the line shack, Zelda was washing dishes at the small table when she turned and nearly collided with Blake. He caught her by the shoulders to steady her, and suddenly they were standing very close, his hands warm on her arms, his face inches from hers. "Zelda," he said, his voice rough. "Yes," she whispered, her heart pounding. "I." He stopped, seeming to struggle with something. "I think you should know that the ranch owner is coming back in 2 weeks. When he does, my job here is done. I will be moving on." The words hit her like cold water. Of course he would be moving on. That was what drifters did, and she had no right to expect anything else. They had known each other barely 2 weeks. She was a responsibility he had taken on, not a choice he had made. "I understand," she said, stepping back and forcing her voice to stay steady. "I will need to figure out what to do before then." Blake's hands dropped to his sides. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead he just nodded and turned away. That night, Zelda lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to Blake's breathing from where he slept on the floor. She knew she was being foolish. She barely knew this man. But somehow, in the space of 2 weeks, he had become important to her in a way that terrified her. She thought about her options. She had no money, no possessions except the clothes on her back, which were Blake's clothes. She could try to find work in Lone Pine, but she had no idea what kind of work a banker's daughter with no practical skills could do in a frontier town. She could write to her father's sister in Boston, but that would mean admitting defeat and likely being sent right back into the life she had fled. Or she could do what her heart was screaming at her to do and take a risk on the man sleeping 5 feet away from her. The next morning, Zelda woke to find Blake already up, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. He looked troubled, his brow furrowed. "Morning," she said, sitting up carefully. Her feet were much better now, though still tender. "Morning," he replied. He did not meet her eyes. "I need to ride into Lone Pine today. We are running low on supplies and I need to check in with the ranch foreman. Do you want to come with me?" "Yes," Zelda said immediately. The thought of staying in the line shack alone all day made her anxious, though she could not have said exactly why. They saddled Rusty and rode out together, Blake sitting behind Zelda this time so she could have the easier position. The ride to Lone Pine took about 3 hours, and as they crested a rise, Zelda got her first look at the town. It was small, just one main street with a collection of wooden buildings. There was a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a church, and a handful of other structures. It looked rough and raw, nothing like the refined streets of Philadelphia. But there was something honest about it that appealed to Zelda. Blake stopped first at the general store, where he purchased supplies. The store owner, A weathered man named Mr. Hastings looked at Zelda with open curiosity but did not ask questions. Blake paid for the supplies with his own money, and Zelda made a mental note to find a way to pay him back someday. From there, they went to the saloon, where Blake had been told he could find the ranch foreman. The foreman, a gruff man named Pete Carlson, was sitting at a table playing cards. He looked up when Blake entered, and his eyes widened when he saw Zelda. "Thorne," he said, standing up. "What in the hell is going on?" Blake explained briefly how he had found Zelda, leaving out most of the details. Pete listened, his expression skeptical. "You have been keeping a woman in the line shack," he said, and there was disapproval in his voice. "I saved her life," Blake said, his voice hard. "What was I supposed to do, leave her to freeze?" "You could have brought her to town," Pete said. "There was a storm," Blake replied. "I could not bring her to town." Pete looked at Zelda, his eyes assessing. "Is that true, miss?" "He saved your life." "Yes," Zelda said, lifting her chin. "He was nothing but honorable. I would have died without his help." Pete grunted. "Well, that is all well and good, but what are you going to do now? You cannot stay in that line shack with him. People will talk." "I am aware," Blake said tightly. "I was hoping you might know of someone in town who needs help. Miss Zimmerman is looking for work." Pete scratched his jaw. "Work doing what? Most women out here work as laundresses or in the saloon, and I do not think either of those is suitable for a lady." "I can sew," Zelda offered. "And I can read and write. I can do figures. I am a quick learner." Pete looked thoughtful. "Well, I know Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house was looking for someone to help her with the books. She is getting on in years and her eyesight is not what it used to be. The pay would not be much, but it would include room and board." "That sounds perfect," Zelda said, trying not to sound too desperate. "Could you introduce me to her?" "I suppose I could," Pete said. He looked at Blake. "The boss is coming back day after tomorrow, not 2 weeks from now." There was a change of plans, so you need to have this situation sorted out quickly. Blake's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Understood." They left the saloon and walked down the street to the boarding house, a 2-story building that looked better maintained than most of the structures in town. Pete knocked on the door, and it was opened by a small, round woman with gray hair and kind eyes. "Pete Carlson," she said with a smile. "What brings you by?" "Mrs. Patterson," Pete said, tipping his hat. "This here is Miss Zelda Zimmerman. She is looking for work, and I thought you might be interested in her services." Mrs. Patterson looked at Zelda with interest. Come in," she said, ushering them inside. The interior of the boarding house was clean and comfortable, with lace curtains and polished furniture. "Tell me about yourself, dear." Zelda explained her situation, carefully editing the details. She said she had come west with a wagon train that had been caught in a storm, and she had been separated from the group. She needed work and a place to stay. She emphasized her education and her ability to manage accounts. Mrs. Patterson listened attentively. "Can you cook?" she asked. "I can learn," Zelda said honestly. Mrs. Patterson laughed. "I like your honesty. I will tell you what, I will give you a trial period. 2 weeks. You will help me with the books, assist with cooking and cleaning, and serve meals to the boarders. In exchange, you will get a small room, 3 meals a day, and $3 a week. If it works out, we will make it permanent. Does that sound fair?" "More than fair," Zelda said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. You will not regret this." "I am sure I will not," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. "When can you start?" Zelda glanced at Blake, who had been standing silently by the door. "Today?" she asked tentatively. "Today works for me," Mrs. Patterson said. "Pete, Blake, thank you for bringing her to me. Miss Zimmerman, let me show you to your room." It all happened so fast that Zelda barely had time to process it. Pete left, but Blake lingered. "Mrs. Patterson, sensing they needed a moment, tactfully disappeared into the kitchen. "Well," Blake said, his voice carefully neutral, "you have a job and a place to stay. That is good." "Yes," Zelda said. "Thank you, Blake, for everything. I owe you my life." "You do not owe me anything," he said. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Zelda, Yes," she prompted, her heart racing. He shook his head. "Never mind. You take care of yourself, all right?" "You too," she said softly. He turned and walked out, and Zelda stood there, watching the door close behind him. She felt like something important had just slipped through her fingers, but she did not know how to grab hold of it. Mrs. Patterson returned and showed Zelda to a small room on the second floor. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window that looked out over the street. It was simple, but it was hers, and that was more than she had hoped for. Over the next few days, Zelda threw herself into her new life. Mrs. Patterson was a patient teacher, showing her how to manage the boarding house accounts and how to cook for a crowd. The boarders were mostly miners and ranch hands, rough men who were nonetheless respectful to Zelda. She learned to navigate their jokes and their rough manners, finding that she liked the straightforwardness of frontier life. But no matter how busy she kept herself, she could not stop thinking about Blake. She wondered if he was still at the line shack, or if he had already moved on. The thought of never seeing him again made her chest ache. On the fifth day, she was sweeping the front porch of the boarding house when she saw a familiar figure riding down the street. Her heart leaped into her throat. Blake was on Rusty, a pack horse trailing behind him. He stopped in front of the boarding house, dismounting with easy grace. "Blake," she said, setting down the broom, "I did not expect to see you again." "I need to talk to you," he said. His face was serious, almost grim. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course," she said. She called to Mrs. Patterson that she was taking a short break and then walked with Blake to the side of the building, out of sight of the main street. "What is it?" she asked, her stomach twisting with anxiety. Blake took off his hat, turning it in his hands. "I have been doing a lot of thinking these past few days," he said. "About my life, about what I want, about you. Me." Zelda's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I have been drifting for 7 years, Blake said. Telling myself I liked the freedom, that I did not want ties or responsibilities. But the truth is, I have been running. From the pain of losing my family's ranch, from the fear of failing again. And I realized something when I left you here. I do not want to run anymore. What do you want?" Zelda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to stop," he said. He met her eyes, and she saw vulnerability there that took her breath away. "I want to put down roots, and I want you to be part of that, if you will have me." Zelda stared at him, her mind racing. "Blake, we have known each other for 2 weeks. That is not enough time to make a decision like this." "I know," he said. "And I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I am just asking if you will give me a chance. Give us a chance. I got a job offer from Pete. There is a ranch about 10 miles from here that needs a foreman. It is steady work, good pay. I can save money, maybe buy my own land someday, and I want to do it with you by my side." Tears filled Zelda's eyes. "I fled Philadelphia to escape a marriage I did not want," she said. "I do not want to make the same mistake again by rushing into something just because it feels safe." "Is that what this feels like to you?" Blake asked. "Safe?" She shook her head. "No," she admitted. "It feels terrifying. Because I think I might be falling in love with you, and that scares me more than anything." Blake's face softened. He reached out and cupped her cheek gently. "I am scared too," he said, "but I think some things are worth being scared for." Zelda leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "What are we going to do?" "We are going to take it one day at a time," Blake said. "I will court you properly. I will come to town on Sundays and take you to church. I will bring you flowers and walk with you, and we will get to know each other." And if after a few months you still feel the same way, then we will talk about the future. Does that sound all right?" "That sounds perfect," Zelda said, opening her eyes and smiling through her tears. Blake smiled back, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. Then very slowly he leaned down and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, sweet and full of promise. When he pulled back, Zelda felt dizzy with happiness. "I have to get to the ranch," Blake said reluctantly. "I start work tomorrow, but I will be back on Sunday, I promise." "I will be waiting," Zelda said. She watched him ride away, her heart full. For the first time since her father died, she felt like she had a future worth looking forward to. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Zelda's life. True to his word, Blake came to town every Sunday. They attended church together, sitting side by side in the small wooden building while the circuit preacher delivered his sermon. Afterward, they would walk through town, talking about everything and nothing. Blake told her about his work on the ranch, about the challenges of managing men and cattle. Zelda told him about the boarding house, about the characters who lived there and the skills she was learning. Mrs. Patterson approved of Blake, which was a relief. She was protective of Zelda, treating her like a daughter. She made sure they were never entirely alone, always maintaining propriety, but she gave them space to talk and get to know each other. As winter gave way to early spring, Zelda found herself falling deeper in love with Blake. She loved the way he listened when she talked, really listened, as though her words mattered. She loved his quiet strength, the way he handled problems with calm determination. She loved his rare smiles and the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. In March, Blake took her out to see the ranch where he worked. It was a beautiful spread with rolling hills and a creek running through the property. The ranch house was a sturdy structure, and the outbuildings were well maintained. Blake introduced her to the ranch owner, a widower named Mr. Donovan, who was gruff but kind. "Blake here is the best foreman I have ever had," Mr. Donovan said, clapping Blake on the shoulder. "I was lucky to get him." Blake looked pleased but embarrassed by the praise. After they had toured the ranch, he took Zelda to a spot by the creek where wildflowers were beginning to bloom. "I wanted to show you this place," he said, dismounting and helping her down from her horse. "I come here sometimes to think. It is peaceful." "It is beautiful," Zelda agreed, looking around at the landscape. The mountains rose in the distance, still capped with snow, and the creek burbled softly. "Zelda," Blake said, taking her hands in his, "it has been 3 months since I found you. 3 months of getting to know you, of courting you, and I am more certain now than I have ever been about anything. I love you. I want to build a life with you." Zelda's heart swelled. "I love you too," she said. "You changed my life, Blake. You gave me a second chance." "You gave me one too," he said. "I was just drifting before I met you, not really living. You made me want to stop running." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Opening it, he revealed a simple gold band with a small stone set in it. "It is not much," he said, "but it is all I can afford right now. Zelda Zimmerman, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Zelda's face. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Blake slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. It was a kiss full of joy and promise, and Zelda felt like she was flying. They were married in May, in the small church in Lone Pine. Mrs. Patterson helped Zelda make a simple dress from blue calico, and Blake wore his best clothes. The church was full of people from town and the ranch, all there to celebrate with them. Mr. Donovan gave Zelda away, standing in as a father figure. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony, and when he pronounced them man and wife, the church erupted in applause. Mr. Donovan had offered them the use of a small cabin on the ranch property, and Blake had spent weeks fixing it up. It was cozy, with 2 rooms and a small porch. Zelda thought it was perfect. Their wedding night was tender and sweet. Blake was gentle with her, patient as they learned each other. Zelda had been nervous, but Blake made her feel safe and cherished. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, talking quietly in the darkness. "Are you happy?" Blake asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her arm. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Zelda said honestly. "I thought my life was over when I fled Philadelphia, but it was really just beginning." "Mine too," Blake said. He kissed her forehead. "I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret it," Zelda said, snuggling closer. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." The first year of marriage was an adjustment, but it was a happy one. Zelda threw herself into making their cabin a home, learning to cook and clean and manage a household. It was hard work, so different from the life she had known in Philadelphia, but she loved it. She loved the simplicity of it, the sense of accomplishment when she successfully made bread or preserved vegetables. Blake worked long hours on the ranch, but he always came home to her with a smile. They established rhythms and routines, little traditions that became the foundation of their life together. Every Sunday, they still attended church in Lone Pine, and afterward they would visit with Mrs. Patterson, who had become like family. In the fall, Zelda discovered she was pregnant. She told Blake one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. He stared at her for a moment, and then a huge grin spread across his face. "We are going to have a baby?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "Yes," Zelda said, laughing at his expression. "In the spring." Blake whooped and picked her up, spinning her around. Then he set her down carefully, suddenly worried. "Should I not have done that? I do not want to hurt the baby." "The baby is fine," Zelda assured him, still laughing. "You did not hurt anything." Blake placed his hand on her still flat belly, his expression awed. "I am going to be a father," he said softly. "I am going to do better than my pa did. I am going to make sure our child always feels secure." "You are going to be a wonderful father," Zelda said, covering his hand with hers. "I know it." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Zelda felt tired and sick in the early months, but Blake was attentive, making sure she rested and ate well. As her belly grew, so did their excitement. They spent evenings planning for the baby, discussing names and making preparations. Mr. Donovan was thrilled when he heard the news. He had become a mentor and friend to Blake, and he doted on Zelda. He gifted them a beautifully carved cradle, which Blake set up in the corner of their bedroom. In April of 1880, 2 years after Zelda had fled Philadelphia, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, with Mrs. Patterson and the town doctor in attendance. Blake paced outside the cabin, unable to sit still. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he burst through the door, his face pale with worry. "Zelda," he said, rushing to the bed where she lay exhausted but glowing. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said with a tired smile. "We have a son, Blake." Blake looked down at the tiny bundle in her arms, and his eyes filled with tears. "He is perfect," he whispered. "He is absolutely perfect." They named him Benjamin Theodore Thorne, Benjamin for Blake's father and Theodore for Zelda's. Little Ben was a quiet baby, with dark hair like his father and amber eyes like his mother. Blake was besotted, spending every free moment holding his son and marveling at him. "I never knew I could love someone this much," he told Zelda one night as he rocked Ben to sleep. "I thought I understood love when I married you, but this is something else entirely." "I know," Zelda agreed, watching her 2 favorite people in the world. "It is like our hearts grew bigger." Ben grew quickly, a healthy and happy child. By his first birthday, he was toddling around the cabin, getting into everything. Blake taught him to ride, putting him on a gentle mare and leading her around the yard. Zelda taught him his letters and numbers, determined that her son would have an education. In the spring of 1882, Zelda gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Ruth, after Blake's mother. Maggie, as they called her, was the opposite of Ben in every way. Where he was quiet and serious, she was loud and joyful. She had Blake's blue eyes and Zelda's dark hair, and she had her father wrapped around her little finger from the moment she was born. Life was full and busy. Blake had been promoted to co-owner of the ranch when Mr. Donovan decided to semi-retire. It was a tremendous opportunity, and Blake threw himself into the work with determination. The ranch prospered under his management, and their financial situation improved steadily. Zelda had her hands full with two small children, but she loved every moment of motherhood. She had never been as happy as she was in her little cabin, with her husband and children around her. Sometimes, she thought about her old life in Philadelphia and could hardly believe that girl had been her. She was a different person now, stronger and more capable than she had ever imagined she could be. In 1884, when Ben was 4 and Maggie was 2, Blake came home one day with news. "Mr. Donovan wants to retire completely," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "He is offering to sell me his share of the ranch. With what we have saved and a loan from the bank, I think we can do it. We would own the ranch, Zelda. It would be ours." Zelda threw her arms around him. "That is wonderful," she said, "but are you sure? It is a big risk." "I am sure," Blake said. "This is what I have been working toward. A place of our own, security for our family. I want to build something that we can pass down to Ben and Maggie." They made the purchase, and the ranch became the Thorne Ranch. Blake had a new sign made, and he hung it over the gate with pride. Zelda stood beside him, their children in their arms, and felt overwhelming gratitude for the path her life had taken. Over the next several years, the ranch continued to grow and prosper. Blake proved to be an excellent businessman as well as a skilled rancher. He hired good men and treated them fairly, and word spread that the Thorne Ranch was a good place to work. They expanded their herd and bought more land. What had started as a small operation became one of the most successful ranches in the area. Zelda became known in Lone Pine as a woman who could be counted on. She helped Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house when needed, organized church socials, and assisted new families settling in the area. She taught several children to read and write, offering lessons in her home. She found that she had a gift for teaching, and she loved seeing children's faces light up when they mastered a new skill. In 1887, Zelda gave birth to their third child, another son they named William James. Will was a surprise, coming 7 years after Maggie, but he was a welcome addition to the family. Ben and Maggie doted on their baby brother, and Will grew up surrounded by love and laughter. As the children grew, Blake made sure they learned the skills they would need to run the ranch someday. Ben showed a natural aptitude for handling cattle and horses, while Maggie surprised everyone by being brilliant with numbers and organization. Blake joked that Maggie would probably end up running the business side of things while Ben handled the day-to-day operations. Zelda taught all 3 children to read and write and instilled in them a love of learning. She told them stories about her own childhood in Philadelphia, about their grandfather Theodore, and about the journey that had brought her west. She wanted them to know where they came from and to appreciate the opportunities they had. One evening, when Ben was 14, he asked his mother about her life before she came west. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, while Blake helped Maggie and Will with their chores. "What was it like being rich?" Ben asked curiously. "Living in a big house with servants," Zelda thought about it. "It was comfortable," she said honestly, "but it was also confining. There were so many rules about what I could say and do and where. I always felt like I was playing a part rather than being myself. "Do you ever miss it?" Ben asked. "No," Zelda said without hesitation. "I miss my father sometimes, and I wish he could have known you children, but I do not miss that life. This life, with you and your father and your siblings, is everything I ever wanted. I am happier here than I ever was in Philadelphia." Ben nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. "I am glad you came west," he said. "Otherwise, we would not exist." Zelda laughed and hugged her son. "I am glad too," she said. "Very glad." In 1892, when Ben was 12 and showing every sign of becoming a fine young man, Blake and Zelda celebrated their 14th wedding anniversary. They took a rare evening away from the children, asking their neighbors to watch them, and rode out to the spot by the creek where Blake had proposed all those years ago. "You remember the first time I brought you here?" Blake asked, dismounting and helping Zelda down. "Of course I do," Zelda said, smiling at the memory. "You were so nervous when you proposed." "I was terrified," Blake admitted. "I thought you might say no." "I could never have said no," Zelda said, taking his hand. "I was already in love with you by then." They sat by the creek as the sun set, talking about their life together. They reminisced about their early days, about the struggles and the triumphs. They talked about their children and their hopes for the future. "I have been thinking," Blake said after a while, "we should build a bigger house. The cabin is getting cramped with 3 children, and I want to give you something nicer, something that reflects how far we have come." "Blake," Zelda said softly, "I do not need a bigger house. I am happy in our cabin." "I know you are," he said, "but I want to do this. Not just for you, but for our family. A house that will stand for generations, that Ben and Maggie and Will can raise their own children in someday." Zelda saw the determination in his eyes and smiled. "All right," she said. "Let us build a house." Construction began that summer. Blake hired a crew, and over the next year a beautiful 2-story house rose on a hill overlooking the ranch. It had 6 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a parlor, and a dining room. There was a wraparound porch and big windows that let in plenty of light. It was elegant but practical, a true home. When it was finished in the spring of 1893, the entire family moved in together. Zelda walked through the empty rooms, overwhelmed by the generosity of her husband's gift. Blake found her standing in the parlor, tears streaming down her face. "What is wrong?" he asked, alarmed. "Do you not like it?" "I love it," Zelda said, laughing through her tears. "I am just thinking about how far we have come. 15 years ago I was starving in the snow, certain I was going to die, and now look at us. We have this beautiful house, our children, the ranch. It is more than I ever dreamed possible." Blake pulled her into his arms. "You deserve all of it," he said fiercely. "You deserve everything good in this world." "I have everything I need right here," Zelda said, holding him tight. "You and our children, that is all I will ever need." The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Ben grew into a capable young man who shared his father's love of ranching. When he turned 18 in 1894, Blake made him a partner in the ranch, recognizing his son's hard work and dedication. Maggie, at 16, was managing the ranch's books and proving to have a sharp mind for business. Will, at 7, was still young but showed promise in everything he tried. Zelda continued her work in the community, becoming a pillar of Lone Pine society. She helped establish a proper school, working with other mothers to hire a teacher and build a schoolhouse. She organized charitable efforts to help families in need and was known for her kindness and generosity. In 1896, when Zelda was 40 years old, she received an unexpected letter. It was from a lawyer in Boston, informing her that her father's sister had passed away and had left Zelda a small inheritance. The amount was not large, a few $100s, but it represented a connection to her past that Zelda had thought was severed. She sat at the kitchen table, holding the letter while Blake read over her shoulder. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. Zelda thought for a moment. "I want to donate it to the school," she said finally, "to buy books and supplies for the children. My father valued education, and I think he would approve." Blake smiled. "That is a fine idea," he said. "You have a good heart, Zelda Thorne." "I learned from the best," she said, squeezing his hand. In 1898, Ben married a sweet young woman named Sarah Walters, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. The wedding was held at the Thorne house, with half the town in attendance. Zelda cried through the entire ceremony, overwhelmed by the realization that her little boy was now a man building his own life. Ben and Sarah built a house on the ranch, not far from the main house, and settled into married life. A year later, they gave Zelda and Blake their first grandchild, a baby girl named Emma. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Zelda felt her heart expand yet again with love. "I did not think I could love anyone more than I love our children," she told Blake that night. But being a grandparent is something else entirely. Blake, who had been equally besotted with little Emma, agreed wholeheartedly. As the new century approached, the Thorne family gathered to celebrate both the new year and the new century. It was December 31, 1899, and the house was full of family and friends. Ben and Sarah were there with baby Emma. Maggie, now 21, had recently become engaged to a young lawyer in town named Thomas Fletcher. Will, at 12, was excited about staying up until midnight for the first time. As the clock struck midnight, Blake pulled Zelda close and kissed her. "Happy New Year, my love," he said. "Happy New Century." "Happy New Century," Zelda echoed. She looked around at the gathered crowd, at the faces of the people she loved, and felt profound gratitude. "Can you believe we have made it to a new century together? I can believe anything with you by my side," Blake said. "You are the strongest person I know. You survived what should have killed you and built an incredible life." "We built it together," Zelda corrected. "I would have died in that snow if not for you. Everything good in my life started the day you found me." "We saved each other," Blake said softly, "and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." The years of the new century brought continued blessings. Maggie married Thomas in 1901, and they settled in Lone Pine, where Thomas established a successful law practice. They gave Zelda and Blake 3 more grandchildren over the next several years. Will grew into a talented horseman, and eventually took over the horse breeding operation on the ranch, developing a reputation for producing quality stock. Ben and Sarah had 2 more children, giving them 3 in total. The main house was always full of grandchildren running through the rooms, filling it with noise and laughter. Zelda loved every minute of it, even when she was exhausted from keeping up with them all. In 1905, Lone Pine celebrated its 50th anniversary as a town. As part of the celebration, they asked longtime residents to share their stories. Blake and Zelda were interviewed by the local newspaper, and Zelda found herself telling the story of how they met. "I was running away from a life that was not my own," she said. "And I ran straight into the arms of the life I was meant to have. Blake saved me, not just from the cold, but from a future that would have suffocated my spirit. He gave me freedom and love and a family. He gave me everything." The article was printed, and Zelda was surprised by how many people came up to her afterward, sharing their own stories of coming west and finding new lives. It reinforced what she had always believed, that the frontier was a place of second chances, where people could reinvent themselves and build something meaningful. As Blake and Zelda grew older, they gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to their children. Ben effectively ran the cattle operation, while Maggie's husband Thomas handled the legal and business affairs. Will managed the horses. Blake still consulted on major decisions, but he had more time to spend with Zelda, enjoying the fruits of their labor. They spent their days working in the garden Zelda had cultivated over the years, riding out to their favorite spots on the ranch and spoiling their grandchildren. It was a peaceful, contented time, and Zelda cherished every moment. One evening in the summer of 1910, they sat on the porch of their beautiful house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Blake was 61, and Zelda was 54. They had been married for 32 years, and their love had only deepened with time. "Do you ever think about that day I found you?" Blake asked, taking her hand. "Sometimes," Zelda said. "I think about how lost I was, how scared, and how you appeared like an answer to a prayer I had not even known I was praying." "I think about it too," Blake said. "I think about how easily I could have missed you, if I had gone a different direction, if I had given up on tracking that deer. Your whole life, our whole life together, hung on such a thin thread." "But it did not break," Zelda said, squeezing his hand. "We found each other and we built something beautiful. We have children and grandchildren who will carry on after us. We have made a difference in this community. We have lived a good life, Blake. A very good life." "The best life," Blake agreed, "and it is not over yet. We have many more years ahead of us, God willing." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear the laughter of their grandchildren who were staying overnight. It was a sound that never failed to make Zelda smile. "I love you," Blake said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you lying in the snow, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Zelda said, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. "You are my everything, Blake Thorne. My rescuer, my partner, my love. Thank you for finding me all those years ago. Thank you for changing my fate. Thank you for letting me," Blake said softly. They sat together as night fell completely, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life rich in love and meaning. The journey that had started with a desperate flight west and a chance rescue had led to this. A legacy of family and love that would endure for generations. Inside the house, their grandchildren called for them, wanting a bedtime story. Blake and Zelda stood, holding hands, and walked inside together. They gathered the children around them, with the older ones helping to wrangle the youngest, and Zelda began to tell a story. It was a story about courage and survival, about love found in unexpected places, about building a life from nothing through hard work and determination. It was their story, though she did not say so explicitly. The children listened with wide eyes, asking questions and begging for more details. When the story was finished and the children were finally tucked into their beds, Blake and Zelda retired to their own room. They got ready for bed with the easy familiarity of decades together, and as they lay down, Blake pulled Zelda into his arms. "I think we did all right," he murmured into her hair, "building this life together." "More than all right," Zelda whispered back. "We did wonderfully." And as they drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the life they had built and the family they had created, both of them felt the deep peace that comes from knowing they had lived well and loved deeply. The years continued on, bringing the usual mixture of joy and sorrow that makes up a life. There were more grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. There were weddings and christenings, celebrations and mournings. Through it all, Blake and Zelda remained the steady center of their family, their love for each other an example to everyone who knew them. As they grew older, They spent more time reflecting on their journey together, marveling at how a chance meeting in the snow had led to decades of happiness. They had faced hardships, certainly, but they had faced them together, and that had made all the difference. In 1925, when Blake was 76 and Zelda was 69, they celebrated their 47th wedding anniversary. The whole family gathered at the ranch, now successfully run by the third generation. There was a huge celebration with food and music and dancing. At one point, Blake led Zelda onto the makeshift dance floor and they swayed together to a waltz, their movements slower but no less loving than they had been decades before. 47 years, Blake said in wonder. Almost half a century with you and it is still not enough. I want forever. We have forever, Zelda assured him, her hand over his heart. This love we have, it does not end. It will live on in our children and their children. We are forever, Blake. Blake smiled and kissed her forehead, holding her close as they continued to dance. When the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Blake and Zelda walked hand in hand to their favorite spot by the creek. The wildflowers that had been blooming there the day Blake proposed were in full display, and the evening was warm and perfect. You have any regrets? Blake asked as they sat on the bench he had built there years ago. Zelda considered the question carefully. I regret that my father did not live to see what became of me, she said. I regret that he never knew you or met his grandchildren, but as for the rest, no, I do not regret a single thing. Every choice I made, even the hardest ones, led me to you and to this life. How could I regret that? I feel the same, Blake said. My only regret is that we do not have more time. I want 100 more years with you. Then we will have to make the most of the time we do have, Zelda said practically. We will fill every day with love and joy, and when our time comes, we will have no complaints. They sat together as the sun set, talking quietly about their favorite memories. They remembered their first meeting, their courtship, their wedding day. They remembered the births of their children and the growth of the ranch. They remembered challenges overcome and triumphs celebrated. As darkness fell, Blake helped Zelda to her feet, and they walked slowly back to the house, still hand in hand. Inside, some of their grandchildren were staying over, and the house was full of life and noise. They said goodnight to everyone and retired to their room where they had shared so many nights together. In bed, wrapped in each other's arms, Zelda whispered, "Thank you for a beautiful life, Blake Thorne." "Thank you for sharing it with me, Zelda Thorne," he whispered back. And they fell asleep together, as they had for 47 years, secure in their love and grateful for every moment they had been given. The story of Blake and Zelda Thorne became something of a legend in Lone Pine. People spoke of the banker's daughter who fled west and the cowboy who found her starving in the snow, and how their chance meeting had led to one of the great love stories of the frontier. Their children and grandchildren carried on the legacy of the ranch, ensuring that the Thorne name remained synonymous with integrity, hard work, and family values. Blake lived to be 80, passing peacefully in his sleep in 1929, with Zelda holding his hand. She grieved deeply, but found comfort in their children and the knowledge that they had lived a full and beautiful life together. She spent her remaining years surrounded by family, telling stories of Blake to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive. Zelda followed Blake in 1933 at the age of 77. Her last words were reportedly, "I am coming, my love. Wait for me." They were buried side by side in the cemetery in Lone Pine, under a tree they had planted together many years before. Their headstone bore a simple inscription, "Blake and Zelda Thorne, together forever." The ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, and the house they built remained the family home for generations. The story of how they met, how a desperate flight west and a chance rescue led to a love that endured for nearly 5 decades, was passed down through the family, a reminder of the power of courage, kindness, and love. And in Lone Pine, Colorado, their legacy lived on, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest adventures and the deepest loves begin with a single act of compassion in the midst of a harsh winter, when one soul reaches out to save another, and in doing so, saves them both.